there was a question about donor support. And let me just clarify that the ILO or the UN is actually not really donors, because we also depend, apart from a very restricted regular budget, we also depend on our capacity to convince governments to give money to particular activities. But let me also say that, for example, you're talking about the EMRIP. It should be a solid framework that should allow the Philippines to really mobilize large-scale support, which we have seen in other countries like Bolivia, like Nepal, that donor countries, particularly those that have ratified Convention 169 and have a strong foundation for supporting indigenous people's rights, like Norway, Denmark, Spain, for example, in Europe, they are giving large-scale support. For example, in the case of Bolivia, I do recall a program of, I think it was around $35 million for recognition of land rights based on Convention 169. So I think there's an opportunity there, but I also think it has to do a little bit also with the management capacity, perhaps, and so on of the National Commission, the trust build-up, etc. And also, I just want to say one word about the so-called aid effectiveness agenda, which is the modality that is now governing the development cooperation between developing and developed countries, which is ruled by the Rome Paris declarations on aid effectiveness, and which push for a much more state-centered collaboration. So basically, state will now give money to states to implement their national policies and programs and so on and so forth. And one risk there is that indigenous peoples will be even further marginalized. So I think it's a real risk, and we can see it happening everywhere. One word on recognition of terminology. As you probably know, ILO is operating with a very inclusive language of indigenous and tribal. And the word tribal actually originated from the recognition of the situation of indigenous peoples in Asia. The Indian government, for example, uses the term tribals. So the origin of this inclusive language was for the ILO to not exclude anybody. We of course know that the term is not really accepted by indigenous peoples now, neither in Africa nor in Asia. But the purpose was to create a language that would be, to not stumble on words, but to create a language that would be inclusive and flexible, and would allow us to go beyond terminology and look at the real situations that the UN wanted to address. Perhaps also one word about what we're doing in India. We are not doing much because we have consulted with the Indian government, and they say that they are not really interested in any kind of ILO assistance with regards to the tribal population, because they are doing fine on their own. So our possibility, for example, to support activities in India is quite limited. Thank you.